Okay, everyone, welcome to Pathways to Literacy. We hope that we're glad you can join us, and we hope that this series, it's going to be a series of 3 workshops and a panel at the end of the month, that you'd be able to join us for all 4 sessions. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Scott Campbell. Do you have the other slides with, there we go. So today we have Scott's workshop, and he's going to give you a talk about his personal journey as a person who was an SEN student and has really come a long way and has been successful in his endeavor to teach and to lead and to support others as well. Our second workshop, can we switch the slide?
Yes.
Okay, so next week, Saturday, same time, our speech and language pathologist will give a workshop on language support strategies, low-tech practices that you can use right away at home and in the classroom. Workshop 3, okay. Will be the following week. That would be Dr. Jeremy Greenberg, and he will talk to us about verbal behavior analysis explained from an ABA standpoint. So that's actually very, very good to understand the behaviors around literacy and issues with literacy. And finally, at the end of the month, workshop 4, really, which is a panel discussion, you can change that. We'll have all speakers. I'll be moderating that panel and also joining in from time to time. And so we're going to really put it all together. At that point, you can ask as many questions as you'd like, and really get into finding out more about why you're here, and more about SEN, and more about all those things that you can do to support literacy in your schools and at home. So without further ado, let's get Scott on tap. Thank you, Scott, for joining us.
Good day. And before we start, I do see Dory and Pema are having some audio problems. They can't hear, but a few people have commented that the sound is coming through properly. Okay. So sometimes it's, oh, actually, maybe I should type that. We get a glitch, and if you exit Zoom and come back in, it fixes the issue. So let me put that in English on the chat as well.
I got it.
Okay, and it looks like we're going through clearly for other people are saying it's nice and clear. Okay, so sorry about that segue, but let me start with the formal part of our presentation and welcome you to this presentation of Pathways to Literacy, a Personal Journey. Now, first, I would like to thank Noel Roberts for hosting this event and also for giving me the opportunity to share my own story. I'd also like to thank Hilda Mann and Dr. Jeremy Greenberg for joining us today. And they're also, you can see them online, and they might also be available for questions at the end as well, potentially. But I'd like to say that their ongoing support, guidance, and advice has been an inspiration, to say the least. And I look forward to everything that they have to say in the coming workshops. However, before we begin, let me actually take a moment to briefly introduce myself. I know Noel has given a little bit of background, but let me kind of expand on that so you know who I am. So my name is Scott Campbell, and I'm an experienced industry professional, licensed teacher, and also a founder of a small not-for-profit educational charity. But who I am and what I do requires more than a simple explanation. There's a whole journey, a story, if you will, and that's what I'd like to share with you today. And for me, this is really a journey towards striving towards literacy. Now, you might think, what's the big deal? Successful people are highly literate. However, in many ways, I am still functionally illiterate without the use of adaptive technology. Now, that might come as a surprise based on my credentials. However, many individuals with learning disabilities are capable of becoming highly successful entrepreneurs and business leaders. But before that can happen, we need to accept what makes us different. Now, when I was younger, I had felt ashamed of being a student with special educational needs because we always talk about learning disabilities. So at the time, I was tormented by being labeled as disabled. Therefore, I did try to hide my so-called affliction.
Please turn your mics off.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. So at the time, as a child, I did try to hide my so-called affliction. And I do think that this is a natural response for most children and also their parents, especially at the beginning, to try to hide or conceal anything that would be considered abnormal. After all, avoiding reality is generally much easier than accepting the truth, at least for a brief moment in time. But let me assure you, living in denial is the worst thing that you can do. And it takes nearly a lifetime of experience to realize that on your own. And that's why I'm here today. Not because I'm an expert in the field of special education or because I offer SEN services, because I don't. I'm here on behalf of the millions of undiagnosed students who are just like me, who need someone to tell them that it's okay, that there's nothing wrong with them, and that they have great potential if they only start believing in themselves. I'm here today to advocate for SEN rights in the same way that so many others have done before me. So with that in mind, while things were difficult for me as a child, adversity only serves to make us stronger, more resilient, and makes us more creative problem solvers. And eventually I began to accept what made me different, and then something remarkable happened. I started to realize that I wasn't alone, and that my so-called disability had actually helped me to develop a variety of highly sought-after job skills. And to illustrate this point, I want to share the hashtag dyslexic thinking, which is now an endorsable job skill. So with that in mind, let me reiterate that we often try to hide our differences out of some misguided sense of shame or fear, as I once did. It took me nearly 30 years before I truly started to believe in myself, to recognize my accomplishments, and to start advocating for those who are just starting their journey like I once did. However, in the process, I also realized two very important things. The first was that I did not accomplish everything by myself. And I'm sure that you've heard the expression that it takes a village to raise a child. And the second was that I'm not as alone as I thought I had once been. But more importantly, that there are many highly successful individuals who have learning disabilities just like me. For example, Richard Branson is also dyslexic as well. Yet he went on to found Virgin Group and is one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our time. But would you consider him as being disabled? I think not. The word exceptional comes to mind. So instead of using the word learning disability, I like to use the phrase learning exceptionality, because the way that neurodivergent people learn is an exception to the norm, and that makes us different or unique, but not necessarily less capable than someone who is neurotypical. But let me start at the beginning of my own story. Now, if you saw our family, you would think that we were a typical middle-class family. But as the youngest of 4 children, my parents knew that there was something different about me very early on. I couldn't speak. So originally, I probably would have gone here, the Belleville School for the Deaf. But before anything could be done, I had to have a proper medical diagnosis. And after 30 years, I can still remember that day vividly. Now, the auditory testing facilities are in the basement of the hospital at the end of a long, dark corridor. And while this is what the room looks like now, at the time, it had black spiky foam pads, a double-sided mirror, and a wooden desk with lots of wires coming out of it. I was then hooked up to all the equipment, and the doctors assessed how I reacted to a series of hums, deep rumblings, and audio centrifuge. And at the time, I was only a child, in a dark room, all by myself. Now, there was nothing wrong with my hearing, and I could hear every little sound, And this made this experience the scariest thing imaginable for me as a child. However, the results were conclusive. I wasn't deaf. Luckily, due to the severity of my condition, we were able to qualify for government-issued home care. Now, for several years, I should say, and she made a profound difference in my life, because without her, I would not have been able to learn how to speak. And more than 30 years later, I can still remember this exact moment that I had spent with her. That's how important she was in my life. And that's what I meant when I said that I did not accomplish everything on my own or by myself. I had my parents advocating on my behalf, access to caring professionals, along with numerous mentors and role models along the way. So it really does take a village to raise a child. And while Christiane has since retired, more recently, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Hilda Mann, who is also a speech and language pathologist, and has really been helpful in helping me as an adult, even in today, many, many years later. But before I go too much further, let's take some time to review some of the words that I will be using throughout my presentation. And the first is special educational needs. Now, regrettably, this word typically carries an undeserved stigma, which I'd like to address right now. Despite common misconceptions, special educational needs does not mean that a child is less intelligent than their peers. It just means that the child may need some extra help to reach their full potential. For instance, we may provide a child with temporary accommodations after a traumatizing experience. While this kind of world-altering event may affect the child's behavior and grades, it has no relationship to their overall intelligence. They may just need some emotional support or an extension on a deadline to deal with their current circumstances. In other situations, we may provide students with long-term accommodations. For example, someone who is blind is taught how to use Braille. Individuals who are deaf learn how to use sign language. And individuals with dyslexia often learn how to use adaptive technology. But none of these examples represent a lack of intelligence or potential. For instance, just think about what the world would be like without someone like Stevie Wonder, who lost his eyesight just after his birth. What about Thomas Edison, who was completely deaf in one ear? And then there's Albert Einstein, who struggled in school due to dyslexia. Or Stephen Hawking, who is one of the most exceptional minds of our times, while also being well known for his use of adaptive technology in his day-to-day life. Therefore, based on these examples, I would like to reiterate that special educational needs does not mean what a lot of people think it does. Instead, embracing special educational needs should be considered a hallmark of an enlightened and tolerant society that helps everyone reach their true potential in life. From there, we move to what's called an IEP, or Individualized Education Plan. This is a document that identifies the child's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities for learning, and possible barriers or threats to the child's ongoing development. So an IEP essentially establishes a strategic plan to help the child excel in life and reach their full potential. And when you put it like that, it doesn't sound all that bad. An IEP almost sounds like a SWOT analysis, which is one of the most important documents in the corporate world. So if these strategic planning documents are desirable in the private sector, then why is there a negative stigma around them in the educational sector? Just think about that for a moment before I move on. Now, an IEP is generally established in conjunction with a psychoeducational assessment. However, SEN support is often provided to many students who do not have a formal diagnosis. This can happen for many reasons, but one of the worst reasons is when parents are afraid of attaching a label to their child. This only hurts the child in the long run, as it limits their access to support at all levels of academia, while also disqualifying the scholar from accessing government funding, bursaries, scholarships, and even equipment subsidies. Therefore, not getting a formal diagnosis to save face only places a child at a disadvantage on multiple fronts. Oh, someone said they can't see the PPT. Did the screen sharing stop, or
No, just keep going.
Okay, it is. Okay. Okay, so the individual on iPhone, it might be that you have my webcam feeds pinned and not the screen sharing. There's 2 feeds in Zoom.
Just keep going, Scott.
Okay, all right. All right, so essentially trying to save face only really puts a child at a disadvantage on multiple fronts. But more importantly, the child is also denied the opportunity to truly come to understand themselves. And finally, there's special education and resource teachers, which I would argue from my own experience are some of the most dedicated and caring people that you'll ever encounter. My psychoeducational assessment from grade 7, which is a full 7 years after I started receiving specialized educational support. Now, these documents are quite long, so I've highlighted a few quotes to give you a glimpse into my past. Scott has attended 2 schools to date. He did not speak until junior kindergarten. And in junior kindergarten, he was identified by the board's speech and language pathologist as having a severe degree of verbal dyspraxia. Therefore, he was referred to the home care program for speech and language pathology. He scored in the 4th percentile for his age on the nonverbal reasoning cluster test and significantly lower on the recall of digits subset, and at the 1st percentile for his age on the spelling and reading and word reading subsets. And it's probably no surprise that my reading and writing difficulties had some correlation with my speech difficulties. And while no apparent cause was determined for my severe level of dyspraxia at the time, future research would identify these issues as a result of a hereditary genetic anomaly. However, my skills in arithmetic and logical reasoning were identified as an area of strength for me. Therefore, it was recommended that I recognize this strength as it would help me develop a balanced sense of self-esteem. Moreover, the report I also identified that both my father and brother had achieved a high level of success in spite of their learning disabilities. Now, based on the results of this report, you can see the extreme nature of my situation, scoring in the 4th, 3rd, and 1st percentiles in the language subsets. However, if you see me today, you would think that I'm highly intelligent, well-spoken, and literate. So how did I get to where I am now? Well, the answer is simple. Community. I had a great support network of people that helped me along the way. My parents were my biggest advocates, and they were not afraid of making decisions based on what would be best for me. As a result, I got to work with amazing specialists and great teachers. But I also met some wonderful mentors that also took an interest in my well-being as well. And what do you notice about these individuals in particular? They all helped me offset my weaknesses by developing my strengths in the sciences, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And it was this balance that was key to my future success, as it helped me play to my strengths in order to offset my weaknesses, and in time, pull myself up in all aspects of my life. So now that you have an idea of the challenges that I faced growing up, let's look at the idea of literacy development. Now, it's impossible for the average person to experience things the same way that I do. Therefore, I've spent a lot of time trying to find a way to share my experiences with you. However, if I was to summarize, I'm the type of person that constantly asks why. Now, some people view this as a behavioral problem, but it's really a sign of curiosity. But how do you satisfy that desire to learn when you cannot communicate properly? It's a monumental obstacle to overcome. Therefore, I would argue that literacy and oral communication skills are arguably the most important thing in life. And if we really think about it, a breakdown in communication skills is generally at the center of most academic and behavioral issues in school. However, a professional like Dr. Greenberg could provide much better insights into this idea than I ever could. And this is something that he'll go into in much greater depth in his presentation in 2 weeks from now. So with that in mind, let's start with the basics of literacy development. As I've already mentioned, the English language has always been an obstacle for me. But the real question that we should be asking is, why did I have such a hard time learning how to read, write, and speak when so many other children just picked it up naturally? Well, the answer to that question would take me years to figure out. So let's start with something very basic. This is the letter A, and it has two similar looking symbols. Moreover, this one symbol also has its own name and a separate sound to represent it. Now, this might seem insignificant at first, but I'd like you to think about how you would explain this to a child. Why is this letter called A, but makes the sound ah, as in apple? Why is it just not called ah? What is the purpose of having a separate name and a sound to represent this one symbol? And while this seems perfectly normal in European languages, we do not see this phenomenon in Asian languages. Now, paradigm shifting questions aside, the first thing that we learn at school is the alphabet and how we can use it to sound out simple words. So let me share some examples with you. Let's take a look at the letter C and the letter K for this example. Now, the name for each symbol is very different. However, the sound that each symbol makes or represents is identical. Curious and curiouser. C sounds like k as in cat, and K sounds like k as in kite. Are these two sounds not exactly the same? So how do you explain this to someone who's trying to learn the language? Or if you still can't communicate properly? It's a real conundrum. Like the classic question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. You need language in order to teach language. But how do you explain things when you haven't yet learned the language? Well, this seems like it should be simple. This one example represents something incredibly complex. And while many children don't have any issues with contradictions like this, others really struggle with these irregularities. For instance, my brain keeps asking why. But how do you ask these kinds of questions when you can't express yourself? So let me elaborate on this because there's nothing English about the English alphabet. Every symbol that we use has been appropriated from other languages. And this has created a linguistic nightmare for individuals who suffer from dyslexia and verbal dyspraxia like me. For example, the letter C came from the Phoenician alphabet. It was then flipped to the direction that it's written today by the Italians, who gave it a more symmetrical shape. In contrast, the letter K came from Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it was given the name Kappa by the Greeks in the year 800 BC. And if we had enough time, we could review the origins of every letter that's used in the English language. It's only then do we start to understand why there's so many rules, rule changes, and contradictions in the English language. And that's what makes it hard for people to learn how to read and write English. Fascinating, isn't it? English isn't really English at all. It's really just a collection of other languages. And as a result, the sounds and the structures of those languages have been incorporated into English over time. As a result, we can see how quickly this idea of using the alphabet to sound out words falls apart in practice. For example, while the word kit can be sounded out properly using the alphabet, other simple words like kite cannot. As you can see, the addition of the E at the end of the word actually changes the pronunciation of the vowel in the middle of the word from I, as in kit, to I, as in kite, which is the same pronunciation as the name for the letter I. But to complicate matters even more, we can also create the same sound in English using the spelling AYE. But let me give you another example. If the letter C is supposed to sound like cat, should this word not be pronounced as kel? So why are both words pronounced cell? For starter, these words are known as heterographs, which are words that have the same pronunciation while having different spellings and meanings. Now, we would never go into these kinds of explanations with a child. However, these explanations would answer those infamous why questions that a person like me is known for asking. And what about these examples? The word a bow and arrow, or the word to bow with respect? In this example, both words are spelled the same, but are pronounced differently. Therefore, while learning the alphabet is an essential part of learning the English language, it is very limited as a long-term language acquisition strategy. As such, after learning the alphabet, we then shift our attention to learning sight words. And this usually happens around grade 1 for most children. Now, I'm not going to go through a massive list of sight words. Instead, I'll focus on 2 examples, the word of and the. Now, let's think about how the word the should be pronounced. Tall, hat, egg. Therefore, based on the sounds, the word the should be pronounced te. Instead, it's pronounced the. Now, sight words are important for learning English because the words do not follow the logic that we would expect the words should sound like based on their sounds in the alphabet. However, they are some of the most common words in the English language. And we use these simple words to teach other more complicated words. And this leads us into another language acquisition strategy, phonics. For instance, sight words allow us to teach letter conjunctions like the TH sound, which makes the sound th, as in the word the, or th, as in teeth. Now, I chose these 2 sight words because these were sounds that I had struggled with for years. And they're also some of the most difficult sounds for Asian students to learn because they do not exist in Chinese, Japanese, or Korean, along with the sounds for R and L consonants, which either do not exist or do not take on the same phonetic structure as we would expect them to in English. Finally, after all that, we learn numerous spelling rules, such as I before E, except after C. However, there's so many contradictions to these rules. For instance, an in-depth study found that there are only 44 words in the English language that follow this rule, while there's actually 923 words that break it. As you can see, things are more complicated than you might have anticipated. But over time, I've learned these concepts. However, at the time of when I was a child, I was unable to comprehend all of these concepts. Therefore, I operated on the premise of trying to sound out words letter by letter. So let's try sounding out this phrase together so that you can see what it's like being dyslexic. I, g, a, d, k, n, I, g, t, a, t, I, n, a, t, I, a, n. Did you get it? All right, that probably was pretty hard to try to read letter by letter. And just trying to sound out everything and then put all those sounds together and make it make sense. Now, this sentence fragment reads as "The Good Night of the Nation." And this would make an interesting book title. However, none of these words would have been pronounced properly if we just sounded the words out using the alphabet. Now, these are common sight words. And the word good actually needs a special rule because the combination of a double O in English does not follow the same rule as other double vowel pairings do. That is, when 2 vowels go walking, the first does the talking. And these 2 words are special, night and nation, which are not pronounced as Kneget and Natian, which you might think of if you sounded them out. However, you probably found it hard to follow this example because experienced readers do not read words letter by letter. And this brings me to my next point, cognitive load theory. People with dyslexia typically try to sound words out letter by letter. As a result, letters often get added, dropped, swapped, substituted, or even inverted. And this is because the human brain can only sequence so much information at one time. Now, according to Miller, this is 7 sequential bits of new information. However, modern research by Cohen suggests that we stick to only 4 new pieces of information when dealing with short-term memory. As you can see, there are several errors in this text, and the order of some similar-looking letters have been swapped, other letters have been substituted, and some letters have even been inverted. And this is what I want to focus on right here, when the human brain inverts a letter. Now, you might ask why letters get inverted by someone with dyslexia. So let me explain why this happens and why it's so significant. We are genetically programmed as a species to recognize any threat to our survival. Therefore, we recognize this poisonous snake as an imminent threat. And if we invert this image, we still recognize the same threat. Our brain is not programmed naturally to differentiate for orientation. However, written language does in fact require us to differentiate for the orientation of symbols. And while verbal communication has been part of a 200,000-year evolutionary process, written communication has only been around for about 5,000 years. Therefore, our brains have not had the same chance to evolve at a genetic level to this relatively new paradigm. So let me now return to the alphabet to illustrate why this is important. Let's start with the letter B, followed by D, Q, and P. These symbols are exactly the same. The only difference is how the symbol is orientated. However, our brains are not genetically programmed to recognize the significance in these kinds of changes in orientation. This concept defies our evolutionary imperative, our very survival instincts. However, this ability to create abstract constructs has helped us to become the most dominant species on Earth. It's a real paradox, and a fascinating one at that. However, unlike someone with dyslexia, the average person does not typically read words by sounding out each letter. Instead, they subconsciously scan across the page, making inferences about each word based on the first and last letter. Therefore, it does not matter what order the letters are in the word. The only important thing is that the first and last letters be in the right place. The rest can be a total mess, and you can still read it without it being a problem. And this is because the human mind does not read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. And there's been extensive research that has been done on this concept. So if you're curious to learn more, here's a short bibliography of the research that supports the claim on my last slide. Now, I've spent a lot of time deconstructing several commonly used language acquisition theories in my presentation so far. And I didn't do this to say that they're bad and shouldn't be used. It's actually quite the opposite. These strategies are actually crucial to learning English. Instead, what I've tried to illustrate is the importance and the value of experienced language specialists, because these are complex concepts that you're not going to find in a generic YouTube playlist that's designed to help you learn basic English conversational skills. But more importantly, knowing how and when to use different strategies to target the specific needs of a child in need can be incredibly difficult, even for an experienced teacher. And this is what Hilda Mann will discuss in her presentation next week as she explores language support strategies, with a specific focus on low-tech strategies that are highly effective and can be used in any learning environment. So now that you have a better understanding of what it's like to be dyslexic, let's look at some of the alternative strategies that helped me over the years. For me, the most valuable tool has always been the use of adaptive technologies. Now, I don't know exactly when I started using the computer, but I do know that I learned how to type before I was able to write. And in all honesty, I still can't write my name properly on paper, no matter how hard I try. However, this struggle to use analog mediums isn't much of an issue for me in the digital age. And in hindsight, my dependency on technology has given me a significant advantage in the modern workplace. But this only started becoming a possibility just over 30 years ago.
In 1990, Apple invested a lot of effort into speech recognition technology. The result was Plain Talk and Macintalk 2, which was released with the Macintosh Quadro series from 1993 onward. It was made a standard system component in Macintosh OS version 7.1.2 and has since been shipped on all Macintosh computers as part of Apple's comprehensive system accessibility standards.
Now, we've come a long way since 1990.
While these early forms of adaptive technology were crude by today's standards, the autonomy, support and independence that a computer offered was a real game changer for many individuals with special needs.
All right, so that is actually Karen, the text-to-speech that I use on my computer nowadays. And you can see it's much more natural than it was back when we had Ralph in the early 1990s. But this is actually those original system voices that have been used now for almost 30 years. Now, in addition to using technology, I also had daily pullouts with a special education and research teacher. And these pullout lessons started in junior kindergarten and continued until I graduated high school in grade 12. Now, the main focus of these lessons was to help teach me strategies that I could use to support myself both inside and outside of the classroom. And that's an important concept. The aim of educational specialists is to help a child start using their strengths to overcome their weaknesses. And this helps to empower them while also helping them to become a fully autonomous learner. Now, originally, I had used Macintosh computers, but when my school switched to a Windows environment when I was in grade 5, the change came with several new recommendations to my IEP during its yearly review. Specifically, a recommendation to use Dragon Naturally Speaking in conjunction with software by Kurzweil Education Systems. Now, for years leading up to this point, the native text-to-speech of the Macintosh OS had been incredibly beneficial for me. Therefore, it was only natural to think that using Dragon's cutting-edge speech-to-text software would be equally as helpful for me going forward. However, speech-to-text requires proper pronunciation. Regrettably, my severe level of verbal dyspraxia made it impossible for me to pronounce words clear enough for the software to recognize what I was saying, even after hours of training the software to my voice. And it would be another 10 years before text-to-speech would actually become a viable option for me to use. Now, this illustrates a very important point, though. An IEP is a living document which requires collaboration between a child, their parents, teachers, and SEN specialists like Noel Roberts, who will recommend and assess the viability of new strategies while also advocating on behalf of the child. And it's also important to understand that there isn't a single universal solution that will fix every issue. Instead, educational specialists work with each child independently to find out the best solution to that suits their needs and their unique learning style. And this requires continual input from the student, teachers, parents, and educational specialists. And that's why an IEP is a living document and not just a report you get once and then forget about. Now, while adaptive technology still plays an active role in my day-to-day life, moving to Japan introduced me to new literacy strategies that I would eventually use in my own classroom years later. And ironically, my time in Japan allowed me to drastically improve my understanding of the English language. As the only foreigner in the school, there wasn't many class offerings that would be suitable for me. Therefore, I was placed mostly in cultural studies and EAL classes, which in the long run actually worked out really well for me. And this is because I was still learning how to read, just like my Japanese classmates were. As such, the strategies that were being used to teach English literacy to young adults was perfect for me as well. And this is when I was introduced to the International Phonetic Alphabet, which has become one of the most useful strategies that I have used to help my EAL students learn new words in my content area, which is actually related to engineering and not to language acquisition. But that said, I believe that all teachers should view themselves as language teachers, regardless of what they teach, because each subject has its own unique vernacular and vocabulary. Therefore, literacy development isn't something that only happens in an English class. Instead, the idea of literacy development should span across every subject and every aspect of our daily lives. Now, IPA is an incredibly helpful tool when trying to learn multiple languages. However, I found that very few native speakers are actually familiar with it. So let me show you how IPA can address all of the issues I experienced when learning how to read and write growing up. and why this has become my favorite low-tech go-to strategy for teaching literacy skills in the classroom. From a very young age, we are taught that the alphabet has 26 letters and that there's only 21 consonants and 5 vowels. However, we have seen that these symbols do not always align to the sounds in the words that they create. And this is because the English language doesn't actually have 21 consonants and 5 vowels as we're told. It actually has 20 consonants and a total of 24 different vowel sounds. And these sounds are then combined to create a total of 510 possible monosyllabic sounds. That's why we have so many sound change rules and different pronunciations for each symbol in the English alphabet. However, this doesn't happen in other languages such as Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. So EAL students can often experience many of the same issues as a dyslexic student does when trying to learn English. And this is an important concept to consider when developing literacy skills in an EAL environment with older students. But let me give you one of my favorite examples. This is a word that I learned in a visual literacy class in university. Now, how would you pronounce this word? I'll give you a moment to think about it. Now, most people would say goatee. However, the correct pronunciation for this word is actually fish. Yes, you heard me right. The correct spelling or pronunciation of this word is fish. Now, that may not be evident at first, but let's look at some other words in the English language. The GH sound in the word tough is pronounced like an F, while the O in women is pronounced like an I. And the TI in nation is pronounced like a sh or SH sound. Therefore, based on all these rule change rules, this word is actually pronounced fish. Now, you would probably never be able to tell this on your own unless you had a literacy teacher instructing you, or you used the IPA pronunciation guide in the dictionary to learn how to pronounce this word by yourself. Therefore, IPA is a great tool that empowers students to be autonomous learners, capable of learning new words on their own. And that's the true power of a specialized literacy teacher or speech and language pathologist. They don't just teach you how to pronounce a word or how to pronounce things properly. Instead, they teach you strategies to become independent and self-supportive learners. Now, to wrap things up, my journey with literacy didn't end there, nor should it. Learning is a lifelong journey. Now, one of the most important things that an IEP will do is to help you understand yourself. And while I have both below average literacy skills, my understanding of apply. Therefore, I played to my strengths and started my own company before even graduating from high school. And for 8 years, I ran my company and utilized my passion for science and technology. During this time, I received many interesting consignments, but this one was one of my favorites. A request to photograph uranium-enriched glass for a number of private collections, some of which you can see in the Cornwall Museum. But first, I had to find a way to show the unique characteristics of each of these items using science. In these images, you can clearly see which one of these had been enriched with uranium and which ones hadn't. But this would not have been evident under normal lighting conditions. And I really enjoyed these kinds of challenges, so I continued taking on obscure contracts. And in 2010, my work in 3D imaging brought me to Korea. While it took me several years of hard work, I eventually went on to patent the world's first 3D reflex microlens imaging technology. Now, most people don't really understand what this represents, to be the first person in the world to develop a new and novel idea. But this is quite the accomplishment. After all, patents are held by people like Henry Ford, Nikola Tesla, Steve Jobs, and Elon Musk. So while my journey may have started with me being ranked in the 4th, 3rd, and 1st percentile in the language subsets, I've gone on to become highly accomplished in my field. But none of this would have been possible if I did not get help along the way. So my advice to you is not to get too preoccupied about how or where your journey starts. If my own life has taught me anything, it's that life is not a race to the finish line, but it's a journey that should be cherished and enjoyed. Now, eventually, I did leave the corporate sector to become a teacher. And this was because I really wanted to bring everything that I'd learned back to the classroom. However, I never really expressed why I took an interest in special education or why I felt so strongly about advocating for SEN rights at the time.
Candidates showed off their gadgets at a Techno Expo this afternoon. Hosted by the Faculty of Education, the teaching students developed and built projects to meet a need in the community. Newswatch's Darren Davis has more.
Technological Education Expo is a smorgasbord of interesting hands-on projects by the technology teachers of the future. Each one of these projects is filling a need in the community, which fits in with the high school curriculum.
All of the students learn through hands-on learning. So one of the things we do at the end of those courses in secondary school is students develop a community-based project. So they apply those skills in the context of helping others.
Scott Campbell has developed this software to help students with developmental challenges take their standardized test in grade 10. He's developed the teaching aid with the use of open software, which addresses the issue of affordability in the school system.
It doesn't matter the operating system, and the test will run with accessibility standards with no software installed. That means it costs $0 for students to take a test.
Now, this was my first project as an educator, to address some of the issues with the grade 10 standardized literacy test, which I had once failed in high school myself, specifically by addressing the issue of accessibility and affordability in the school system. Now, at the time, the cost of a computer system that the school board was issuing came to about $6,800 per student. And I, for one, could not afford that myself at the time. But I would not have had the insights necessary to do this if I had not experienced all the things I did growing up. And it's only later in life can we see how these experiences have really enhanced our lives. And that's why I'm sharing my story today, to show you that special educational needs is nothing to be ashamed of. And quite frankly, neurodiversity is more important to solving the world's problems than you could ever imagine. And this is something that Dr. Greenberg can talk over the years. However, when I decided to come to China to teach, I essentially lost the professional support network that I had built up over the years back home. And as a result, things were challenging for me for quite a long time. And this was really because I had no one to talk to or confide in. No one who really understood what I was going through as someone who still struggles with communicative issues. I know I still use text-to-speech. I still use speech to text. I still use adaptive technology. And this sometimes can be very difficult in the workplace because my colleagues don't always really understand what's going on or why, or how much of a struggle it is for me to respond to an email. It might take me an hour sometimes to respond to something that you would think is something quite simple, because it takes me a long time to process the language to really respond in the way that I want. However, in time, I did develop those support networks and the way that I had them back home. And it would take me several years, but eventually I did meet Noel Roberts, who really became a great friend and a great mentor to me. And soon after meeting Noel, I really stopped hiding why I was passionate about advocating for SEN rights, and I started sharing my own story more freely. And this was something that I did not do at the start of my career. Soon after that, I met Dr. Jeremy Greenberg when I attended one of his presentations at the Senya conference the other year. And since then, I've had a number of fascinating conversations with him. And finally, I met Hilda Mann, who's a speech and language pathologist. And they have become my support network here, both personally and professionally. But the most important thing that I can reiterate is that I would not have become the man I am today without the support of caring professionals. And that's my story, my quest to constantly strive for the pursuit of literacy and the people and the strategies that made it possible. Now, I hope that you've enjoyed this presentation and that I've been able to dispel some of the misconceptions that surround special education. After all, everybody has their own journey in life, and it's not a race. We all walk through life at our own pace. So don't be afraid of the journey that's before you, or for asking for help along the way, because every experience that you have will shape what you will go on and accomplish later on in life in ways that you could never imagine. And with that said, I would like to thank you for attending this presentation of Pathways to Literacy, a personal journey. Now, before we start the Q&A session, let me also remind everyone that next week on Saturday, February 11th, we'll be hosting the second free workshop in the series, which will be Language Support Strategies, Low-Tech Practices That Work with Hilde Mann, who's a speech and language pathologist and expert in her field. And from my own personal story, it really shows the importance and the value that these kinds of specialists really have. Now, this presentation is going to be amazing, so I highly recommend that you do mark it in your calendar and save the date. So again, thank you for attending this presentation of Pathways to Literacy, a personal journey, and we'll now be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you, Krista. I was glad that you enjoyed it. So if you do have questions, you can ask them in the chat box, or maybe we can use the raise hand function, and then you can take yourself off mute and then ask it verbally if you would prefer.
Good morning.
Morning,
Hey, Jennifer.
Yes, thank you for sharing your story. It was very inspirational. We needed something like this. We needed persons who had challenges to really come out and to see, I have this challenge and this is how I am overcoming it, and I want to help others like myself. But so my question is, in terms of students who have been diagnosed with special needs, what do you recommend for them in terms of autism, being on the autism spectrum, or have some other learning challenges?
Yes, for specifically with autism, Jeremy is much more knowledgeable in that, and I do believe he's going to be doing a whole psychological profiling on behavioral analysis. That's actually the main focus of his presentation. So I'll really kind of let him elaborate on that in a lot more detail in his presentation. But one of the things that we've really discussed a lot in preparation for this series is how important communication is. And a breakdown in communication ends up being the source of a lot of behavioral issues, behavior issues that we need to address before we can get into some of the more academic focuses. And even with autism, we often see and focus on the behaviorals. And even myself growing up, I always asked why. I wanted to know why. And this was viewed as a negative behavior issue. People are saying, oh, this child is defiant. He's ignorant. He's always asking why. He's not accepting what I'm saying. But it's not really a behavior issue. It's actually curiosity. But because of the breakdown in communication, it shows or presents as a behavior issue. And there was actually a number of conflicts, sometimes where my parents would have to come into school, talk to the teacher, and the teacher would say, this child has a serious behavior issues. And when we actually got to the root of things, we realized, no, it's not a behavior issue. It's actually a communication issue. Things are getting lost in translation. The child is actually, in my case, I wanted to learn, I wanted to ask questions, but it came off as being defined. It came off as a negative behavior. And although I'm not autistic, and I don't want to kind of speak on behalf of autistic people, individuals, I believe there's probably going to be a lot of similarities where, there's individuals with autism often have a hard time communicating and socializing in similar ways as I had as a child. And this can be very frustrating, can be very challenging. So again, communication is key. But I've worked with both more in my professional career than I have in my educational career. But in my professional life before going into education, I'd worked with a number of autistic individuals, and the way that their mind works is fascinating. It's amazing, and they're really misunderstood. But their ability to process and store and recall information is phenomenal, and in many ways, I wish I had that ability. In the field of engineering, just to be able to kind of have all that information in my head. I'm really bad at storing and recalling information, but I'm really good at sequencing it. But that really kind of goes into this idea of neurodiversity, and we need differences. We need to find out what people's strengths are. We need to play to those strengths, and we need to work together and build off of each other. So, unfortunately, society, we are so focused on wanting everyone to fit into this mold. And there's a great kind of cartoon where there's a fish and an elephant and a monkey and a bird, and the teacher saying, climb that tree. But each of those animals has its own strength, its own unique ability. And we really need to be able to do that with the children, is to really find out what they're good at and using their strengths, and helping them develop a balanced sense of self-esteem. And we have a lot of these issues where, regardless of what it is, for me, it was dyslexia, dyspraxia, and dysgraphia. For someone else, it might be autism. For someone else, it might be ADHD. But it's trying to find that balanced sense of self-esteem so that the child isn't acting out in a negative way, but applying themselves and focusing themselves. And we find with students with attention deficit disorders, and it's not that they can't focus, it's actually that they're over-focused. So everything that's happening is a huge distraction to them. But if they learn how to focus themselves on a particular task, we end up getting what's called hyperfocus. And they can just dive into a task, and there could be an earthquake and they'd still just be focused on what they're doing. And it's amazing what they can accomplish when they get past that negative stigma, when they stop viewing what makes them different as a disability, but an exceptionality. It's an exception to the norm, but it also is their greatest strength.
Absolutely. Jennifer, that was a really, really good question. And I think, as you can see, there's so much, involved in that answer, and we can certainly take that further offline. There's another question, though, by Beam that I'd like to address. May I know your opinion on teaching IPA to young children or adults who are new to English language?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm not a language teacher myself. I teach STEM, and so I teach intermediate to senior grades. Normally, I get students in around grade 7, so I don't really have a lot of experience with those very young ages. But again, Hilda is going to be going into a lot of low-tech strategies next week, and she has a lot better expertise in teaching a wide range of students from all age groups. But I know from my experience, it's been incredibly helpful for my intermediate and senior students, particularly my EAL students. But one thing that I had done before, and I taught one literacy class in my 10-year career. But it was actually to a group of students who were actually being held back because their English literacy level was not, it was deemed insufficient to move forward. And I was asked, would you be interested in teaching and developing this program? And I said, sure, it's outside of my area of expertise, but I'd be interested in doing this. And so I had a whole bunch of Chinese students who had been learning English for 10 years, and they were not allowed to progress into grade 10. Because their English level was not sufficient enough in the bilingual system. And so the first project I asked them to do was to explain, what's difficult about English. And pretty much every response from my students in that class was that they were dumb or they were unintelligent. It was pretty much unanimous. And I could really see the break in their confidence. And when you don't believe in yourself, it's hard to learn a language. And so the first thing that I did with that group of students was essentially bring them through this whole aspect of some of what I covered in today's presentation. But I actually started after that one introduction lesson. I actually spent one class to teach them Japanese. And the whole point of teaching Japanese, when the goal was to teach English, was to actually show them that they could learn a language. And I really like Japanese in the sense that there's actually only 126 unique monosyllabic sounds in Japanese. It's actually phonetically a very easy language to learn. And so I had this whole group of grade 10 students who struggled for 10 years to learn English and then kind of gave up. And then here they are thinking that they can't learn language. And within a 45-minute period, I had them asking simple sentences in Japanese. And they started realizing, oh, it's not me. No, I learned all these phrases in Japanese really quickly. And then I went into the structure of Korean, which I think is really fascinating. I could go on about hours about Korean, and then compared Chinese and also English, and looking at all of these different structures. And what's interesting is when we look at Japanese, Korean, and Chinese, is the sounds don't change, but they do in English. There's all these contradictions. And we can also see the structure phonetically. Japanese has very few sounds. Chinese, even with the tone changes, I think we have about 458 unique sounds in Chinese, about 10,000 some sounds in Korean, but over 170,000 unique sounds in English. English is actually a remarkably difficult language. And going through kind of this breaking down what makes things different. Difficult really helped to build those students. Me, it's actually this language is very difficult. And then from there, I started teaching those students IPA. And we spent about 3 weeks learning IPA with those students. And they went on and made huge progress. Many of them increasing their Lexile level by about 300 to 400 points in a single year, which is not common. Usually a typical Lexile gain per year is usually around 60 to about 150. So, significant growth in lexicon and also in self-confidence as well. But it's really important for, first to recognize, some of the issues and realize it's not necessarily all us, it's not all internal. But we also need to realize that, even if you have something like dyslexia or dysgraphia or any of these learning exceptionalities, we also can't just use it as an excuse to say, oh, I'm dyslexic, therefore I don't need to learn how to read because it's difficult for me. We have to consider it as a responsibility of, yes, I'm dyslexic. I understand that reading is difficult. It's going to take me more time. It's going to take me more work, but it's my responsibility to overcome it. And that's also a very important thing as well, is we need to understand that, yes, there is an obstacle for us, but realize that it's an external influence and that it's not our fault, so that we can develop that sense of self-respect, self-worth, self-esteem, so that we can take ownership of it and realize that despite it's going to be the difficulty of the path, we need to take ownership and it is our responsibility. And that's one thing that sometimes doesn't happen, is that ownership afterwards.
Absolutely. Actually, when you keep saying that it's not your fault, there is research that says, and you mentioned that these kids were in EAL or ESL for 10 years. There's research that says that at the 2-year mark, what begins to happen is a diminishing returns both in English and their mother tongue. So having had those kids in EAL for 10 years, I can see why they're confused, and I can see why they're having struggles grasping the language. And I can bet too that they're having difficulty in their mother tongue as well. There's another question here that maybe I'd like to answer first. It says, how to access a student with special needs. Chinese families might dislike the idea if we tell them about their kids' challenges. And yes, that is a challenge. What we are doing, however, is part of our mission is to be able to upskill parents, to help them to understand the importance. And I think that's an underlying agenda here today as well, and for this series, is for those parents who are in attendance, that they better understand that, you know, all is not lost, you know, and there are things that we can do and that your child can be successful. So it's a matter of teaching the parents, upskilling them, and giving them hope. Scott, do you want to add to that?
Yes. To be honest, we had very similar cultural perceptions in the West about 40 years as well, where, you know, special education, it's, you know, we started hearing a lot about it in the early 1910. There was a lot of kind of philosophy about that. But even in the 1980s, it was still quite kind of a taboo thing, and most people kind of hid it. And my generation was really kind of the first generation where it was more commonplace, it was more central and more recognized. But a lot of people, when they saw my mother kind of going out of her way and saying, okay, well, no, I'm going to get this help for my child. I'm not going to be afraid of, you know, going to these parent-teacher conferences and saying, okay, well, my child has this diagnosis. Now, a lot of her friends were like, well, why are you portraying that? Why are you telling the teachers at these meetings that he has this IEP? You know, aren't you afraid? And, you know, there's still that cultural stigma, but now it's so commonplace because we've had time for an entire generation of students to go through a special education program. You know, my generation is really the first where we've grown up from childhood, and you're starting to see the results. And so you start looking at it, and, you know, my success, you look at the success of someone like Elon Musk, you know, all these great innovators, you know, they all had special needs. But it takes, you know, an entire generation for people to go through that system and for you to really see the results. And it's hard to kind of take that leap of faith, to take that risk at the beginning. And in China, you know, we are really kind of entering that phase of special education that we were kind of in the 1980s, 1990s. We're kind of in that same spot where, you know, people are, it's becoming more culturally acceptable, but we still haven't had a full generation of students in China go through a special education program. So we don't see the many you know, role models who are Chinese who have come out to say, well, I had dyslexia growing up, but I overcame it, or I have autism growing up. But if you look at some of the professionals, some of the leading industry leaders in China, and you really kind of start psychoanalyzing them, there's a number of individuals who I bet you are special needs individuals. It's just they never got diagnosed. They fit all the profile traits. But again, without knowing, you just kind of go through life and you do the best you can. And without really having that knowledge, it's a lot harder. Knowledge is power. And the more you know about yourself, the better you can adapt and you can strive and use your strengths. So, you know, there is a lot of cultural taboo around this issue, particularly in Asia. A lot of parents will not want to risk that, and I totally understand. And I think most teachers will do whatever they can to accommodate their child, particularly in the K through 12 education system, without putting a label on. I know in my class, there's lots of students who do not have an IEP, but I can see that they're struggling, and I'll go out of my way to provide them the support I would for a child with an IEP, just because it's the right thing to do. So as teachers, we always look at what is in the best interest of the child, and we will help children even if they don't have a formal diagnosis. However, the problem with kind of being culturally sensitive in that regard is we look at the long-term support and effects. And by not getting that formal diagnosis, the child doesn't necessarily know why they're struggling, which can really hinder their own confidence, which can have negative impacts on their learning. But it also can have a lot of other issues. I needed specialized speech and language pathology. Christiane, my speech and language pathologist, she had never worked with children before. She actually worked predominantly with people who had strokes, older individuals. And Hilda's in a similar situation. She's works with a lot of stroke survivors, but she also works with children as well. But these are really expensive professionals, and I would have never been able to afford a speech and language pathologist. But luckily, because I had that diagnosis, it was covered by government issued insurance. So I didn't pay for Christiane's services. The government did. It was part of my insurance. So by having these formal diagnoses, you might find that, yes, you have to pay for that diagnosis, but it might end up saving you a lot of money in the long run, because specialized treatment and services, like particularly in some of the more extreme cases, as mine was, might end up qualifying you for it to be covered by insurance. Additionally, it's in Western countries, there's actually also a lot of government bursaries and subsidies. So if you have a formal diagnosis and it's indicated that you need a computer, you can actually get computers issued by the universities in some cases where the university pays for it. So again, you have equipment subsidies. And there's also university entrance criterias, which recognize special needs. So if you have two identical applications and one student is special needs and the other isn't, the individual with special needs is actually more likely to get into that university program, because they've actually demonstrated that not only are they able to meet all of the entrance requirements, but they've actually done that despite numerous challenges. So university entrances are actually a really complicated process. And there's a whole equation of different factors. And a lot of people think it's only about GPA, and that's actually only one small portion of it. And so the more criteria in which you qualify for, they each add additional points. So
yeah, I think
not only
I don't want to cut you off there, but yes, I think in the China context, Scott, the university entrance exams, IB and AP exams, are the ones that are really requesting sometimes, for a child to be given a formal diagnosis so that they can get accommodations in the exams. Other than that, in the China context, it's very difficult right now to give a diagnosis, because unless the parents actually understand it and want it. I think Hilda, if Hilda is here, and if Hilda can weigh in on that as well, because she has worked in the China context as have I, and we find that it's easier at this point. It doesn't matter what we call it. You can call it apples, I can call it oranges. It doesn't matter, as long as we're looking at the same thing and I can support those symptoms. We can, keep moving and keep the focus on the child. Hilda, do you want to say anything? Is Hilda? Okay, let me help her out. Yeah. Hi, Hilda.
Hi, do you guys hear me?
Yeah, I hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, what you're saying, Scott, is true. A diagnosis is definitely necessary for students to get the different accommodations like the laptop, and to be accepted through a learning disabilities program for university. But a lot of times when the kids are just in primary school and they're evidencing problems in China, the parents definitely are against having their child be identified or be pulled out. And so that's when I find that let's forget about the diagnosis for now. Let's treat the symptoms. Let's give the kids some help. Let's do some RTI, some MTSS, which is like doing push-in the classroom. And that way it looks like all the students, and in fact, all the students are getting help. And so the parents don't feel that their child is being stigmatized, and they're open to that help. And then once we get our foot in the door that way, it makes it easier to push for more services, because they see the benefit and they see that the child is improving, and the self-esteem, such as what you had talked about, the self-esteem improves, and the child starts to understand what their own strengths and weaknesses are, and then they can start self-advocating. And it's a nice little snowball effect where this is what I have found to work during my years of working in China, that the parents are more receptive to this.
Thank you, Hilda. We're very excited to hear more about your presentation and hear more about techniques, low-tech techniques and practices next week. So if you are not busy next week, everyone, please tune in to Miss Hilda Mann, and she will expand on a lot of her ideas during her presentation. Okay, are there any more questions? If not, I think we are way past time, but that's okay. A lot of you are still here. Any other questions? If you have other questions, you can ask them in the group, and we will certainly be able to answer them for you. Not a problem. Okay. Any other questions, anyone? Thank you, Hilda.